For this video with it, we need to understand basically is the first thing is we need to go, before we actually go into tariffs, we need to go into what actually is the idea of how government actually reacts with problems and how they actually solve them. Basically, what they actually do is their actual actions are intervening in either personal liberty or economic liberty and doing more intervention into your lives. Even when you see the right wing cut taxes, what they're doing with it, they're not actually reducing the spending, which is merely all they're doing is kicking the can down the road when it comes down to the actual cost. They're taking the cost in taxation and they're passing that cost because they're not willing to cut spending. They're putting that into debt, which is actually passing the cost on to inflation. This is merely what they're doing. When we're talking on the left, what they're doing is they will do on these things on they love to spend a lot of money on regulations. Now we need to go on the idea of tariffs, understanding how these things work. Now, when we understand on the idea of tariffs, basically we need to understand what the government is doing. What the government essentially is doing with it is, as always, intervening in it. Now, how these things work is how trade really works is you have the consumer wants the product, business provides product to consumer. Now you can have basically products that can either be domestically provided, which is all parts of it are domestically acquired and produced, and those would be that is domestically provided to the consumer. And or you could have it where some or all parts are provided on a foreign level, and what ends up happening is when the government wants to intervene and use protectionism, which they've now relabeled what they call quote unquote fair trade, they will basically and they'll use this to assist certain industries or certain specific companies. And what ends up happening here is they will put these tariffs on these foreign goods, might be from specific countries, might be from all countries. And what ends up happening is this will raise the cost of those goods. Now, we will also have an impact on those domestic prices as well, because there's going to be a shift in overall prices on the bottom level prices of goods, as well as the domestic producers, which might be higher as well. So what ends up happening is when you see those goods come in, that's essentially what it is doing, is you're actually providing a tax. This is basically an import tax on the businesses that want those either raw materials or the actual full out assembled materials to sell to their consumers. Then the consumer faces what would be the normal up price with it as a normal business good provided to them, and they now pay higher prices for those goods than they would normally, as compared to the domestic goods. Now, the domestic goods, in comparison in the market, usually end up getting an inflationary increase as well to keep within the actual price ranges. And this is what usually happens. You'll usually see it across the board because of the way the market goes with the actual increases on price. And this ends up being what actually occurs, because people assume when they use this idea of fair trade, they assume that the U.S. manufacturers are not going to move their price. But because of the impact of rising price on the low end, it ends up being essentially an inflationary cost across the board. And when you're inflating the lowest prices, it's going to basically still create, it's going to essentially create an inflationary impact across the whole industry. So it allows those other makers to essentially inflate their prices to keep everything at an even flow. And of the actual whole market of how it works, because now they can actually take more profit. because of the way things work. It's not necessarily like they're actually going to be paying more money with it or anything like that to their workers. Workers do not have any advantage with it. It just creates a larger bubble when we're talking about the economics with it, because these things are only going to last so long. And what ends up happening is usually these things blow up because people end up buying less of these US made goods, because the fact is what ends up happening is the actual companies themselves, they're not using 100% US made materials because we don't have these. We're not a fully self-sufficient country. If you compare us to, let's say, for instance, China. China is a fully self-sufficient country. They actually have all the goods they need. Anything they actually import from the United States or Europe would actually be considered a luxury good. That's why any trade war with them would actually be a losing cause, because they're not actually looking for anything from the United States specifically. They're actually just looking for luxury goods. And when they put a tariff on our goods, they're actually just doing it because they're trying to encourage their people to buy these local products. That's merely what they're trying to do. Now, in the case of the United States, we don't have that option because of the fact that we do not produce enough, and we have a plethora of people within our country that might have a diet that's based on a lot of shipped in goods, and such as food and stuff, such as food supplies that might be shipped in from foreign countries. We might have people that have that might, due to their income levels, require imported goods because their income levels are not high enough to support USA made goods, because the labor costs in the United States is far too high and our production levels are far too low. And that makes it very, very difficult for people in the United States that to actually afford an actual legitimate lifestyle. And what ends up happening is we can look in comparison to countries that have actually had free trade. If we look at now, we have to ignore the ideas of personal liberty, but if we look at economic liberty of areas like Hong Kong, the economic liberty of Hong Kong is quite wealthy. If we look at the areas such as Singapore and Switzerland, we can see that they're quite wealthy as well. And if we compare it to the United States, with it specifically, since over the decades with it, we've actually pushed ourselves down with it, and we've actually been running, to one degree or another, nationalist policies for the last 140 years. And these are actually, we've been running them for one degree or another. And nationalism is actually, and this idea of protectionism, which is essentially what nationalism is actually destroys an economy. If you want to see what the actual end effect of nationalism, you don't have to look any further than Venezuela. Now, you basically have the options of being one of free trade, where it ends up going to where you see one of the wealthiest countries, or your ideas of nationalism, where you see and protectionism, where you see the poorest countries. And this is the reason why, is because you're forcing people to buy products that are basically dependent on price controls and more and more government intervention. And this is something in which we find that the more the government wants to intervene in the economy, the worse it's going to get. And essentially what nationalism does is it intervenes in a very, very harsh manner. And what we found under Trump is he exploited this to the most extreme degree. And we're still doing it with it under Biden as well. That's why when I see people complaining a lot about lumber prices, why lumber prices have exploded. Now, there's two reasons why they exploded. Number one is because not only did we have the tariffs still going on from Trump, but Biden expanded on those tariffs, and then we've also have not been able to sell any bonds since March of 2020, debt bonds, and accruing more and more debt and basically paying it off by printing more money, that's going to basically directly impact with direct inflation. And that was happening because we were obviously irritating the two biggest holders of foreign debt bonds, being Russia and China. And when you do that, you're not going to exactly have your best ability to essentially kick down the road with it. And then when you start adding on massive amounts of debt, in which our worst president to date that's actually finished a full term on debt was Trump, and the fact is that yet he was producing record levels of revenue when you still have that he was doing beyond record levels of spending. And he can't blame that on Democrats, because he could have let spending expire, and but he still wanted to basically take a wasteful department such as the Pentagon, and when they had already found 28% of waste in 2015, and give them basically another 20% onto their budget. And he wanted to give them that and add basically a laughing stock of a department added onto it, being the Space Force, thinking that we need to fight space aliens, and then add on more with building a wall, which is stealing people's property at the southern border, instead of actually realizing that being anti-immigrant is only going to make the country worse, meaning that basically our founders actually believed in the free movement of people. When you start to look at basically the actual going back to actually ideas of polls with it, which I've gone to before, is that basically the country is pro-immigrant, has actually been shown vast majority of pro-immigrant and vast majority of pro-free trade. This means the country does not want to be poor, and the country wants to bring in people who want to actually work and create business. They do not want to basically be stagnant and basically have a country with policies that are going to basically be going downhill. They don't want that. And people are sick of that. People are sick of basically of the mediocrity of nationalism and the policy, the anti-business policies of nationalism as well when it comes down to immigration. And people are sick of it. And what this comes down to is that people want more business to flow into this thing with, and this goes into the ideas of tariffs. Now, tariffs are basically going to impact the actual consumer. Now, what has happened with it is we have people that have come up with some of the most crackpot theories on supporting it. Basically, the only people who support this are nationalists and socialists. These are basically fringe idea people with it. Even people who believe in Keynesian economics have basically stated that the idea of tariffs are bad. We get them believing with it. Neo-Keynesians believing it. People believe in the classic economic thoughts believe in it. Austrian economists believe in it. Basically, the only ones who don't believe in it are people who are basically pretty much want to lean pretty much close to modern monetary theory, which, when it comes down to actual accounting practices, would actually violate standard accounting practices, which would be illegal. Those are the only people who actually support the idea of tariffs, are the people that actually want to essentially do things that are completely illegal when it comes down to actual accounting practices. And this shows you where it's actually coming from. It's coming from people who either don't understand anything about economics, or B, actually want to flout the law when it comes down to economics. And when we actually follow the law, when we actually have people that actually want to follow the law, those people are actually in 100% agreement that tariffs are bad. Tariffs only are basically, it's another sales tax on the actual consumer. This is all what it is. There's nothing else that it could be stated as. It's essentially, the best way to put it is, it's a added consumption tax onto the actual tax that it is. And it's saying, how dare you actually want actual foreign goods, foreign raw materials in your actual devices, your vehicles, your anything you actually buy. And when we look at our country with it, our country just is not self-sustaining. It's not going to be self-sustaining. Pretty much the majority of the fruit that we buy is coming from overseas, because to have fruit year round, that's the only way we can actually do it. And when we start to look at that, that's why the idea of free trade actually benefits us. So we don't actually have illness in our country. This is actually what has actually made our country very, very healthy. And unless you want to become to the level of like Somalia, you're not going to actually support this. And that's where we need to come out at. And because not only is it bad for health, when it comes down to food, when it actually comes down to the actual cost of materials, it actually stifles business. When it comes to all building materials skyrocket in prices, and everybody's feeling it, yet nobody actually wants to blame the actual source of the tariffs. Everybody wants to say, well, if we would have stuck with Trump's trade war. Trump was never going to end the trade war, and China was never going to give in, because China's actually shown what their intentions were. Their intentions were basically, if the U.S. wanted to continue a trade war, they were going to flip their idea of who they were going to focus their trade on. Instead of trading with the U.S., they're going to trade with East Asia and Europe, and basically ignore the United States. And they're just going to bump us right off. And because they're going to say, we don't need you anymore, and we're actually going to get closer to real value on our products when we actually trade to these places, instead of actually giving you extreme discounts for basically sending us trash. And the trash being the US dollar. The US dollar is trash. It's not worth anything, because we have by far the most debt in the world. And when we start basically policing the whole world, and when we start sending foreign aid around the whole world, that's a waste of money. And China blatantly sees this, and they realize that there is no reason to continue trading to a country that's basically devaluing their dollar. And when that happens, there's no reason to actually send goods for something that's worth nothing. And so when we were trading with them, we were actually getting a massive deal. Anytime our companies would trade with their companies, we would get a far better gain with it, because we were getting more value per our actual cash that we were sending out there. And that was what was happening with it. And the fact is, when we see these ideas, these deficits, that just means our goods are basically so inflated in price that no one actually wants to buy them, because of the actual of an actual internal problem. Now, the internal problem was actually being caused by our actual debt that we're actually creating ourselves. This is what was actually causing it, because we're actually spending far too much. Our actual guns and butter economy was what was causing it. And because we keep inflating our dollar year after year after year, and we're not actually giving out real inflation numbers, that's what was causing the problem. That's why no one wants to buy any of our goods, because they're basically well overvalued. And you're not getting the actual value that you actually want. They're actually going to want to get something close to even value. And when you ship overseas, and then you basically say, oh, we want tariffs on top of that. Well, the fact is, when you start, we want to basically punish you for basically, we want to basically make it harder for your goods when they come in to be sold. Well, and yet we want to basically ship our goods, and we want you to basically do it without any tariffs with it. Well, we weren't even trading on an honest basis, and that was the whole thing. We wanted an essentially unfair advantage, knowing that our products were well inflated in price because of our inflation that has actually gone over the years. And when we started to ship these, when we were starting to do these trade deals, there was these international trade deals, we were not being honest. And that's something that was going on. So when we start to view these trade deals out and out with everything, it ends up being the fact that we were not and ever being honest with any of these people and any of these countries with it. So it ended up being very, very negative. And we saw the actual impacts of all these things with it, because we can't sell any of our real manufactured products outside of our own country. Yet when it comes down to, and then we were even going as far as the products that we could sell, such as our stuff out of the agriculture out of agriculture, we were putting what are called tariffs on that stuff in such a way that, and doing protectionist on that in such a way that we could not even export it to other countries, and basically it caused many farmers to actually go broke and have to basically find some other way to accommodate. And these were basically a lot of Midwest farmers that ended up basically losing a lot of money. And Trump's solution to that one was basically just, let's just subsidize it. That's basically causing more debt, which is causing more problems for our manufacturing. And his problem is always spend more money out of the government. And this has been basically the problem that we were actually doing. His idea is spend more money out of the government. And this is where we actually have gotten to our actual issues. We can't keep spending more money. Spending is actually our issue. Our issue is actually spending that's actually caused all of our problems. And what we need to do is massive cuts. And we need to, if we do massive cuts and start reducing our debt and start selling off such things as government buildings and government land and such things as that, we can actually start reducing this debt down and stop having such a centrally controlled government that is basically more reminiscent of some of these communist countries than anything else. I mean, that's not exactly what our founders actually intended. And when we actually see it, that's why when we start to see all this protectionism, basically they promise basically results with it, but they don't even understand the way trade works. Trade is not a government's trading other government goods. The only way that actually happens is when you have basically two governments that have fully seized the means of production. In the United States, they have not seized the means of production. Even in the case of China, they have not fully done that. Even though China is actually not true communists. They're actually what we would refer to as being socialist. They're not truly a communist country because they have not fully seized the means of production. This means they're not actually such and such a company that is a Chinese company, as we've seen Alibaba and things like that have actually been Chinese companies that are actually run in mainland China, not just in Hong Kong, but actually mainland China, which is actually shows that companies can actually run in mainland China without, even though they're basically limited in personal freedoms, they actually economically can actually run. And though they might be inflicted with a lot of economic problems as well, we're seeing that basically that this is something in which they're not going to have issues when it comes down to where their company is going to be part of the government. It's not going to be a government entity. Now, what's happening in the United States is they're basically we have these nationalist and socialist economists. They're almost believing as if they're trading from basically a totally centrally planned company, totally centrally planned economy, from one to another totally centrally planned economy. You're not actually, there is actually pretty much around the globe, there's pretty much, as far as I've seen with it, there's really nothing out there like that that we've actually established trade deals with. And that's something in which we would find that this doesn't really exist. We're finding that people are actually doing individual deals from companies. You're having business to business and business to consumer. It might be international. Consumers might be ordering things internationally. And also we're finding that consumers are also ordering things from businesses that actually order things from overseas. Trust me, there are plenty of actual companies here that order raw products and also fully assembled, also fully created products from overseas. This actual thing is what actually drives our economy. And this is actually going back to the ideas of even Ronald Reagan actually pushed for the idea of free international trade. And he did this because he knew that basically the countries that do this are actually the wealthiest. He actually pushed far against the ideas of protectionism. He knew protectionism was the way that countries destroy themselves. Yet, basically, we're talking that less than 40 years after his initial election, we're talking that we have the same party that nominated him basically turned tail, and or I should say about 40 years after his election with it. Basically, the party has turned tail and is actually now embracing the exact opposite policies. Instead of being very, very liberal on immigration, they're being very, very restrictive. In fact, they want harder and harder restrictions. And he was one that was actually that actually pushed to pass a plan to legalize people who are quote unquote illegal as immigrants. He actually gave them amnesty because he knew he knew that the immigration law was unjust. And and as well, he also, on top of that, when it comes down to trade with it, he was one that actually pushed for free trade. When it comes down to the current party with it, they're anti-immigration and anti-free trade. This is something which you should never see from an actual Republican Party. And that's why they're pushing for the actual destruction. I mean, the Democratic Party, I'm not saying is any better, because they're still embracing to some degree with it to pander to some of the socialists in there with it, to this idea of protectionism. And they're pushing to this idea. They're not exactly ones to embrace free trade. I mean, they're definitely a little bit better than Republicans with it, but they're not exactly ones to count on that with it. When it comes to immigration, they've not exactly moved that far when it comes down to overall as a party. Both are far from even the Republican under Reagan with it. Both are far from that stance. And that's a really, really a shame that they would actually be that point with it, that they would be what I call far more restrictive than that. And yet we have the Republican Party saying, the Democrats have this extremist agenda. Sorry with it, but the Democrats are actually the only thing extremist with it is that basically they're closer to Republicans than they should be. And the fact is that Republicans are actually authoritarian in their actual agenda, being an actual nationalist, just like Venezuela is, and people, which is what actually caused Venezuela to actually crash. Venezuela, Burma, as well as other nations, which is actually what caused them to economically crash. Because when you start basically centralizing everything and saying you have to basically, for any personal decisions and pretty much every one of your economic decisions, you have to basically clear it with the actual executive branch. It's basically at that point with it, you're talking that's an authoritarian government. They don't believe in any personal or economic liberty at that point. It's very, very limited. And it's pretty much, unless you kiss the ring with it, you're not going to basically have any access to any liberty. I'm basically going to cut it here with it because I think I've gone over the point of why the tariffs are bad with it, because we've obviously gone over how it's an actual tax and not an actual thing that would ever benefit people, because we've gone over how we cannot win a trade war, being that basically how China is self-sustaining, we are not. And I'm going to cut it right here, and that's it. And bye, everyone.